So now I get to introduce Flint Dibble, who's going to talk to us about urban foodways in classical Athens.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you everybody for coming. So yeah, as Mark said, I'm an environmental archaeologist and a historian of food. So I try to look at food in ancient Greece. Specifically, can everybody hear me in the back? Yeah? Great. So specifically, I spend most of my time looking at animal bones, trying to understand how animals were raised, how they were processed, and how they were cooked and how they were consumed. But I try to integrate that within the larger picture of Greek history and other kinds of archaeological remains. And so I want to look at one case study today, the case study of classical Athens, the first kind of large city that we can think of in the Greek world. Within the walls it had about 50,000 people, and within the plain around up to 250,000 at its height in the classical period. And so being able to feed this city was obviously a challenge, but also we know that they fed the city. And so I'm interested in how sort of daily life, how the lives of people changed as the city was built, and how specifically foodways changed in the city as it became an urban center. And so let's look at that. When you think about classical Athens, you probably think a lot about philosophy with Plato's Academy, or you might think about the birthplace of democracy with the foundations that were established in Athens, that in many ways some of our democracy is based off of. Or perhaps you think about the Persian Wars or the Peloponnesian Wars that took place and the Delian League, the empire that Athens used to kind of enrich itself. Or maybe if you go and visit Athens, you'll be thinking about temples like the Parthenon. And all these things are fabulous, these events, these monuments, these activities. But what I really try to focus on in my research is the people. And the people that occupied the city and how they lived their lives right there. And in order to do so, I mean, we do get kinds of evidence such as art that gives us a picture of these ancient people and what they were doing. And we can look closer at the art and understand that, for example, these white marble statues were actually painted in color. But a lot of times art and text, they present a kind of idealized view of people. And so I really want to try to get at the reality of how people's lives changed in this urban context. And in order to do so, I really focus on the kind of remnants of daily life. Specifically, pottery is one of the things I spend a lot of time looking at, the ugly pottery, not the nice painting that you saw on a pot that you usually see in a museum, but the kind of stuff that's just used for cooking or for storing food or for fetching water. The other thing I'll look at is animal bones, these sort of ugly bones that many archaeologists didn't even save for the last 100 years that they've been digging in Greece, and really very few people pay attention to this kind of trash. But I think they tell a really, really interesting story about life in the past. For example, I don't know of many texts or art that mention butchered dog and people eating dog. But right here, this center thigh bone, it's from a dog and it has a nice cut mark right here. So they were actually eating dog in Athens and at other sites that I see. And so what I'm really trying to understand is trash. And because trash really gives an unvarnished look at the reality of the past. And if you just look at your own trash cans, your own recycling bins, you'll see that they're full of foodstuffs or food containers. And so a lot of what we have in terms of the trash that we dig up from the past has to do with food. It's one of the things that we can get a really detailed picture at. And so that's what I want to do for us here in Athens. And specifically, I want to look at foodways, sort of the overarching system of food in the past. Not just looking, for example, how they supplied the city, but understanding how they transported food, how they stored food, how they prepared food, and how they consumed food. And how these all kind of change in tandem as society is changing, as the city is being developed in the past. And so that's the kind of research that I'm focused on in my career and where I am in Athens right now. And so in many ways, it's a lot like counting sheep. That's a lot of what I'm doing. I'm counting sheep, I'm counting goats, I'm counting pigs, I'm counting cattle. But in reality, I'm actually counting animal bone fragments of sheep, goat, pigs, and cows in order to make sense of this sort of refuse from the past. The other thing we'll be counting, of course, is pots. And again, sometimes we do get these nice complete pots, but a lot of times we're just counting these fragments here that we dig up, and we can't always put them back together, but they represent what was used in the past. And we got to try to make sense of this kind of voiceless evidence that we get in huge numbers. I mean, there's nothing we find more of than pots and bones. And so really, my main thesis here is that as the city itself is built up and developed, new infrastructure is put in, this actually affects the lives of ordinary people in Athens. They change what they're eating, and what I call it an urban cuisine that is developed in Athens at this time. And every aspect of food systems changed, and it all relates to them actually constructing a city that actually affects how they live in it, and how they get their food, and how they prepare their food. So, I think the first thing to start off with is a little case study on water in Athens. I think it's a nice little topic that we can use to then apply to food itself. And so we have the Athenian Agora, which is the downtown area of Athens. It's been under excavation since 1931 by the Americans. And they've uncovered about 150 wells and cisterns. The wells are in blue and the cisterns are in green. And multiple fountain houses and spring houses. And for most of the time of Athens, especially early on, all they were really getting water from was from wells and cisterns, presumably near somebody's house or shop. So we're talking about private water supply in a sense. And if we look at the number of wells and cisterns over time in Athens, they actually remain fairly steady from the 6th century down to the 3rd century. The water table does seem to drop, so a lot of wells are replaced by cisterns, but at the same time the number of these private water sources remains steady. And instead what's introduced in the 5th century and into the 4th century is the construction of sort of civic water fountains and springs. And these are very monumental. These fountains are pumping in water from the mountains around Athens from very far away, and it provides running water that's accessible to the citizens of Athens. And the Athenians understood that this was an extremely important thing to protect. So in fact, if you know much about the Athenian democracy, many of the positions in the democracy were chosen by lot. For example, you might get a text phone message that says, now you're a senator. But the person who ran the water supply in Athens, that was an elected position, because they understood that this was extremely important to be able to protect and to be able to develop more. And so what we see is an increase, a huge increase in the amount of water that's available in the city with this running water, these fountains that are placed right in the middle of the city and up by other monumental areas and then even off by the edges. A lot of Athens is still unexcavated, but I imagine there's even more of them to be found still. And so we know the Athenians were using these fountain houses. It's mentioned in text. We have art showing people fetching water inside their water vessels from these running water fountain houses. What I find very funny, of course, is this is a painting on a hydria, which is a water vessel, of women holding hydria, waiting in line to fill their hydria with water vessels. So while you wait in line, you can see a painting of yourself doing what you're doing. It's very, very meta in a sense. The Greeks were very, very meta, and so I find that to be kind of ironic. But what I want to look at is these sort of water vessels in context, where they're found, so we can understand how they're used. And so out of those 150 or so wells and cisterns, the bottom layer is oftentimes what archaeologists call a use layer. It's actually full primarily of water vessels. So while you fetch your water, you actually drop one by accident. And so we get these bottom layers full of mostly complete, actually, water vessels as they settle to the bottom. And we have hundreds of them from these contexts right at the bottom. And we can look at what they're using over time to fetch water and how it changes. And so if we look at this sort of in the Archaic period, so from about the middle of the 6th century down to 480 BC, we find the most common shape to be what's called either a jug or an anakoi. I know the anakoi means a wine vessel, but these are found at the bottom of the well, so they're clearly used for water. They're basically the same thing, just a small jug about this big with a handle that can be used for fetching, and since they have a spout, for pouring liquid. And so that's the most common form that we find. But at the same time, we find a number of other vessels in these sort of bottom of the wells, in the cisterns. And so these are larger vessels, amphorae, kados, hydria, and peliki. They can range from something about this big to even about this big. And they're all made mostly in a sort of coarse fabric. And what's interesting about this coarse fabric, especially for a large vessel, you imagine you're storing a larger quantity of water in your house. This coarse fabric, it's very porous, so water gets out, it sort of sweats. And you'd think that would be bad, but that's actually a good thing. It helps cool it. The evaporation helps cool it off. So they really paid attention to the recipes for their clay in order to make their water vessels keep the water a little cool when they're storing it in their households. And so this is actually really surprising, because if you open up a textbook on Athenian ceramics, the way we understand our ceramics is oftentimes from this iconography, like sort of this picture of a hydria on a hydria. And so if you open up a textbook of Athenian ceramics and you read about hydriae, they say they're used for fetching water from fountains, because that's what we see on iconography. While the images of people fetching water from wells, they have what's called a kados. And so if you open up that same textbook, they'll say the kados is what you use in a well. But what I'm actually finding is a huge range of vessels in the bottom of these wells. And so it's not just one or the other, it's actually a variety of things that are used perhaps for different contexts, a quick little bit of water that you can pour out immediately at the table, or a larger vessel that can be used to store the water in your house that'll keep it cool. And this actually changes drastically over time. So this is what you see before the construction of all these fountains and spring houses, right? And so what changes is while these Onokuian jugs, these smaller jug-type vessels, they stick around at the bottom of the wells. Most of those really large vessels are no longer in the bottom of Athenian wells after about 400 BC. And so from 200 to 400, the really large vessels disappear. And instead what we see are even smaller vessels come in. These things called cantharoi. You can see how they have two handles. Just like the rest of these vessels, they all have handles so you can tie something around it and throw it down the well and be able to lug it back up. And so these would have been used maybe for a quick gulp of water. And so one of the things that I hypothesized is that this change from a variety of different vessels of different sizes to a smaller number of types of vessels, all smaller in size, is due to the fact that there's more water available in the urban environment. There's not as much of a need to fetch large quantities of water for your household and store it for a long enough time. Instead, water is available on a more local basis, and you can just use a smaller vessel, and in particular, sort of the all-purpose water jug, something about this big that's used for fetching water and then serving water in the household itself. And so a lot of this, I think, has to do with these changes in urban infrastructure that increases the amount of water in Athens, and you can see how people's lives are changing with that. So let's move on to food now, and keep what I just mentioned in mind, because I see a lot of similar things going on as the infrastructure of the city is improving and the economy changes. And so I feel that the people adapt to these changes as well. And so Athens, as we all know, during the 5th century, it controls a large navy, and it actually controls the Delian League. And so we have many historical references for the importation of food from all over the Mediterranean. For example, large supplies of grain are coming from the Black Sea, Egypt, from the Aegean, and even from Sicily. And so we have a sense that they're importing all this into the city. Ceramic vessels holding wine or olive oil, known as amphorae, we find them in the city of Athens themselves, and we can trace where they came from based on their style and the type of pots they have. So we know that they're importing large quantities of wine and olive oil into the city on a regular basis. But we even get more than that. For example, the member states of the Delian League, they had to contribute cattle on a regular basis for the festivals. So we know that animals themselves are being imported. And shipwrecks off the coast of Turkey, for example, have vessels full of cattle ribs and other types of meat products. And so we figure that these are cured meat products that can be imported, that are part of this trade that's going on in this area. And then, of course, textual references mention sort of odder things as well, like, for example, eels are a delicacy from Lake Copais, just to the north. And so you can imagine if you want fresh fish or fresh eels, how do you get that in the past? You pretty much need to have a vessel that keeps them alive in salt water and fresh water. And so that's why we think that fish and eels and things like that are so much more expensive than the rest of these things, because it's not that easy to get fresh fish without refrigeration or freezing. And so, at the same time, the Athenians recognized the importance of this trade to supply their city. So before the Peloponnesian Wars, they built these long walls connecting the city of Athens to the port of Piraeus. And that way, while the Spartan army had a more powerful military force on the ground, and they could sort of raid the lands around Athens, Athens could continue to feed itself because it had the larger navy, and it was able to import these products to be able to keep the population afloat at this time. And they planned out their port of Piraeus very, very carefully, arranging it around a nice grid plan, an orthogonal grid plan, so that goods and resources could travel fairly quickly and be organized very quickly to flow to and from the city along that road path. And we see similar organization, of course, inside the city. If we go to the Athenian Agora itself, we see a series, for example, of stoi ringing it. And these are sort of these colonnaded buildings that could have been broken up into little stalls or shops to be able to sell things. And we also have some more commercial structures, multi-room structures in the corners. And they're full usually of animal bones and seeds and pots. And so we get the sense that they're selling food there. But don't forget this huge empty space right in the middle. This would have obviously been, and we have from textual sources, the sense that this would have been a sort of open-air market. Maybe not every day, but many days you could go there for your farmer's market to get seasonal foodstuffs. You can get animals, you can get meat products, including cured meat products like sausages, and you can get fish and salted fish and your whole range of food right from the marketplace. And so I want to look at how this marketplace develops and what kind of evidence we have for it. So specifically, like I mentioned, I usually look at environmental archaeology and I study animal bones. We're going to have to ignore the evidence from plants for right now, because collecting plants is a lot more difficult, and it's not really been done very much in classical Athens or in other contemporary sites. It's been done more frequently in the prehistoric period. And so we're going to have to look just at animal bones to be able to understand the food economy. And you might be saying to yourself, wait a second, the ancient Greeks, they probably just ate animals very, very rarely. Right? That's sort of what we're thought to think of, is that today we eat far more meat than the ancient Greeks too. And while that's true, there's a growing amount of evidence that show that the ancient Greeks, and specifically the Athenians, actually ate more meat than we think they did. And so I think that animal bones themselves can act as a proxy to understand this larger food economy until we collect more of these seeds to be able to understand plants. So why do we think they ate more meat? The first piece of evidence we have is the evidence from dietary isotopes from human remains. So you can actually do nitrogen isotope analysis from human teeth, and it gives you a sense of the quantity of animal protein in humans' diets, right? And so in Greece, from the sites that have been studied, and there's a recent survey on this published in 2015, they mentioned that it appears that animal protein consumption, it drops at the beginning of the early Iron Age, and then it starts to increase again in the classical period. And so we're seeing this as a period where they eat more meat. And on top of it, there's been intensive study of isotopes from cemeteries in Athens itself. And Athens is at the very top of the meat eaters in Greece, from both prehistoric and historical periods. In fact, one of the individuals from Athens, and this was true a few years ago, I'm not sure if it's still true, but one of the individuals that was studied had the highest amount of animal consumption in their nitrogen isotope ratio out of anyone in the pre-modern world. And so we're actually talking about a significant amount of meat in their diet. Maybe not as much as we eat, but still it's more of a component of their diet at this time. And if we look at this sort of isotope ratios, this meat consumption across graves in Athens, we're actually seeing that regardless of burial type, males eat a similar amount of animal protein. So whether you're buried in an elaborate sarcophagus or precinct, or whether you're in just a simple pit, a simple earthen pit, you actually had access to a similar amount of meat, or animal protein I should say, that includes dairy, in your lifetime, whether you were male or not. And this is broadly true of females as well, except for the females that were buried in the really simple earthen pits. So many of the upper class and middle class women in Athens were actually consuming similar amounts of meat as the men. It's just the lower class women that seem to have been consuming less. So this seems to be fairly broadly across the spectrum, with a few exceptions. Children, though, did not have as much animal protein as the adults. And we can see this because of these temples. You think about these temples as sort of houses of the gods, but what they were a venue for large-scale feasts. And in particular, large-scale animal sacrifices, so that the community could come together and feast on meat. And we have this sort of in iconography and in text, the whole ritual we can put together. In fact, they burn certain bones, the thigh bones and tails, as offerings for the gods, for example. And the rest of the meat, on the other hand, is distributed to the population that takes place in these feasts. And a study of the sacrificial calendars in Athens and Attica and the large-scale sacrifices actually suggests that most Athenian citizens could get free meat about once a week, which is actually pretty sweet if you think about it. I wouldn't mind some free meat once a week. But this gives you a sense for partly why the Athenians were actually consuming a reasonable quantity of meat. But the animal bones I have actually relate, they're all from the Agora area, and almost all of them don't seem to come from sacrifice. As I mentioned, they sort of do a very specific ritual where they burn the thigh bones for the gods and the tails, and most of those bones are not burned in the Agora. We do have one deposit we'll look at later where that is, but that's next to an altar. The rest of these bones are not burned, including the thigh bones and the tails, and they seem to largely be due to commercial or residential activities or industrial activities in this area. So let's see what we can say about animals in Athens. So the first thing we can do is break it down into species type, right? There's 4 main animals that the Athenians and most Greeks ate, which is sheep, goat, pig, and cow. You're going to see a few of these graphs, so I want to make sure you can read them properly. So the cattle are always going to be in yellow here. For example, in the early Iron Age, they make up a little bit over 20% of the animal population in Athens. The pigs are always going to be blue. The sheep are always going to be light green. And the goats are always going to be dark green. So you can see that over time, goats dominate the assemblage in Athens prior to 600 BC. But then after 600 BC, there seems to be a fairly equal division of these species in the Archaic and the Classical period from about 480 down to 300 BC. And so I want to see how this compares with other sites in Greece to see if this is different or not. So let's step back in time because there's more bone studies from a little earlier. And let's go to the Late Bronze Age, a period of these palaces, sort of at Mycenae or Knossos or Pylos. And we have texts from these palaces that mention, for example, large herds of sheep that are used for raising wool. And what's really interesting is most of the sites in Greece at this time, sheep is the most common animal at almost all of them. And so this accords pretty well with the textual evidence we have for the economy at that time. It's not only sheep, obviously. Sheep don't dominate, but there's clearly an emphasis on sheep. After the collapse of these palaces, though, things changed drastically in the early Iron Age, so around 1000 BC or so, 1000 to 700 BC. And what we see is now there's a wide variety of animals that are the most common at each site. Sheep don't seem to be the most common everywhere, and instead one site like Athens has goats, another site has pig, another one sheep, another one pig, another one cow, another one goats. And so there's sort of this more regionalism, this diversity in what different sites are focusing on. And so one of the ideas I'm playing with right now is that around this time there's a change in climate. It becomes a little drier and a little colder. And I'm wondering if this is sort of a local adaptation to these changes in climate at these different sites. I'm not really sure yet, but it's something that needs a little more investigation, and it's something I'm working on. Yeah?
Then they call them on Knossos. Why is a sheep on top of it when there's no green for sheep in the whole
Here's the
column?
sheep.
Oh.
The light green is the
a
sheep.
sheep or goat.
Yeah.
I see.
Oh, this is, yeah. So some zooarchaeologists early on, they couldn't distinguish between sheep and goat, but that's sort of been mostly resolved now, at least for many of the specimens that are more complete. And so, yeah. So what I do is I take.
Sorry.
Yeah. Don't worry, you're fine. I should have explained that. Yeah. Some other zooarchaeologists have not identified sheep and goat very clearly, and that's why. And so I'm more looking at the ones that don't have this bright green line. Okay. Sorry. Let's go on. And then in the historical period, as you can notice, first of all, very few settlements have actually been studied. It's because most of these animal bones have been thrown away. And in fact, I'm really the only person that's working on these periods for animal bone studies. I've studied 3 of these 7 sites here. And we see that same diversity. Do you see what I mean? There's still this diversity of different species being focused on. But one of the things I seem to be noticing is the larger cities, like classical Athens. I mentioned before how it has a fairly even distribution of goat, sheep, pig, and cow. Same thing in Hellenistic Knossos, which is a fairly large city as well. A fairly even distribution of goat, sheep, pig, and cow. And also, where is it? Hellenistic Cassiope has, again, a fairly even distribution. On the other hand, when you look at smaller towns and villages like Azoria, it's very much dominated by goat. Or Eleftheron, very much dominated by sheep. Or New Halos, very much dominated by sheep. And so what I'm wondering is if these smaller villages are focusing on certain animals, while these larger cities are sort of importing animals in fairly equal numbers. And so they're getting them perhaps from some of these smaller settlements. I think we need more settlements to be studied to be sure of this pattern, but it's sort of the working hypothesis I have right now. And so this is really interesting because we can compare this. This is the historical Greece, from about 600 BC down to about 200 BC, or 100 BC, sorry, to textual evidence at the same time, right? And so I've gone through and I've counted animals through a database of ancient Greek called the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, counting animal terms. And you notice what dominates pretty much every genre is cattle, right? But if you look at what's going on with the actual animals themselves, where are the cattle? They seem to be the least common at most sites. And so we can actually see this as well in iconography. If we look at Attic vases, for example, they display cattle 70% of the time and very rarely display sheep and pigs. And so this is why I mentioned before we have to be careful with these kind of idealized representations that people do of themselves in art and in text. And we can sort of filter it out through the trash itself that gives us a context to understand how people are portraying themselves. It gives us that sort of reality check in a sense. So let's zoom in more closely on Athens and what's going on in the city itself. So in the Archaic period, before it becomes super urbanized, from 600 to 480 BC, do you notice how each of these bar graphs looks pretty similar? It's a similar number of cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats in each of these deposits or areas, right? And so it's kind of the same species are in each of these deposits across town. This is something I've noticed at a lot of other Greek sites. So even though the proportions between sites is different, the proportions within a site, you notice that Late Bronze Age Philakope in different trenches, they have similar proportions of animals. Or if you notice at Archaic Athens, they have the same kind of proportions of animals in different buildings in different types of contexts. Or if you look at, for example, Hellenistic New Halos, each of the different houses has a fairly similar assemblage of animals throughout there. And this is what I see in Archaic Athens. And one of the things I'm interpreting this as is kind of a smear of trash that's going across the site. They're probably eating similar types of animals, but it's not a large enough city to have proper waste disposal outside of the city. Because when we see this change in classical Athens, so after 480 BC, notice each of these bar graphs looks completely different. Each of them are drastically different. And so the way I actually am interpreting this is now most of the trash is going out because the city has become fully urbanized in the city center. And occasionally there's a convenient dumping spot, a well that goes out of use, or a pit that gets dug. And so some major activity that's taking place nearby quickly fills that pit with whatever they have on hand, animal refuse or whatever. And so we can see that really clearly with animal bones. I could show you with pots as well, but I don't have time right this second. For example, near the Altar of Aphrodite Ourania, all we get is burned sheep and goat remains, primarily the thigh bones and the tails. Or we get some wells that are full of horn and bone working refuse that must have been near a sort of workshop in the area. It's mainly just cow and horse bones that have been sawn through to be able to produce sort of styluses and blanks and things like this. Or chopped horn cores of goats that would have been chopped to get the horn off to be able to turn it into something like a pocket knife or whatever. The horn itself doesn't preserve. Horn is made of keratin. So all we have is the bony core itself. But I get huge deposits of this kind of horn and bone working refuse, all discrete with each other. Or I might get a collection of sort of household items. In this well, we get all these worked astragali, these knuckle bones as they're called, and they're all kind of polished down, and there's a lot of other children's toys in this well, and so we think these would have been dice or other kinds of children's toys that could have been used in here. It's from a well, if you guys might know it if you've read Kathleen Lynch's recent book on the symposium in context. Or, for example, one of the ideas that we know these deposits were filled very quickly is we get whole joints of meat, joining pieces. For example, a radius and an ulna, that even though they're disconnected from one another, they came from the same limb of the same animal. Or, for example, this mandible, you can even see the difference in color. It was in different layers of the well, but it joins back together. And so they're sort of dumping in these cuts of meat very, very quickly. Not cuts of meat, but the bone refuse from activity. And this well itself, I think, is full of butchery refuse. We get most of the well is heavily, heavily butchered, primarily with cleavers. And so this represents a major change in what's going on in Athens. And so, for example, I think these are professional butchers because I plot out butchery marks on bones in very, very precise zones. And you can see most of the zones on a tibia have very, very few cleaver chops, right? Except for right here, this chop that you see right here. What that is the leg is turned upside down and they're chopping off the kneecap. And so it's a very, very consistent activity that I'm interpreting as professional butchers. Actually, I don't see this activity at other sites very frequently, so it's an Athenian sort of thing. And this is interesting because we see cleaver butchery become more common over time. So in the early Iron Age, a smaller proportion of the bones are butchered with cleavers, chopping through them, rather than knives that leave slices on the bones. And so you can see this increase in the pigs, in the sheep and the goat, and even in the dog. It jumps up and we see this increase in cleaver chops. And we can compare that to other sites too, where there's been similar studies done. And in the Agora in Athens, there's far more cleaver chops as a percentage of the overall bones than at other sites. And so what I think is going on is this is the development of kind of professional butchery. At these other sites, for example, these are localized in feasting deposits, sort of related to sacrifice of large scale or large numbers of animals. But in the Agora, we see it sort of in that one sacrificial deposit, but also in these urban contexts. And to be able to put together this kind of chaîne opératoire of taking apart a carcass, how they do it, they're always very, very consistent about it. Whenever I plot these chop marks on the skeleton, they're showing up in very consistent locations, which is why I think it's very professional. And so I can put together the whole range of things. So the first thing they'll do is they'll string up the carcass, and they'll actually have it strung up by the back legs, and with a cleaver, they'll chop right down the middle through the vertebra. That's actually what you see in the top right there, is those vertebrae chopped right in half to split the carcass in two. And then what they'll do is they'll flip the carcass upside down on a table or strung up by the legs again, and they'll do a big chop through the shoulder joint and then through the hip joint, right through the socket, and that'll take off the different legs. And then, of course, they'll do that knee chop, that knee kneecap chop that I showed you earlier, and then they have a similar chop on the elbow. And at that point, they've dismembered the carcass into a smaller number of cuts. And this is a totally different style of butchery than what we're seeing elsewhere. And it's extremely consistent with what I'm seeing. There's a few differences between different species, but overall they're fairly consistent. This is creating a vastly different repertoire of the cuts of meat that you can get in the city. I don't know if any of you have eaten sort of a difference between things chopped by a cleaver or what you get here with a bandsaw in America. But the lamb chops we get here are totally different than what you get in modern Greece, because we use a bandsaw to be able to slice through to get these even cuts from the leg. The lamb chops in Greece are all done with a cleaver today, and you get these nice, delicious vertebra and rib cuts. That's why if you go to Greece, get the lamb chops. They're fantastic. But the steaks, on the other hand, are much better here, and that's because of a different style of butchery. It creates a very different cut of meat. And so that's what I mean by a kind of urban cuisine that's being sold in these marketplaces. The other thing they're doing is they're breaking several of the larger bones, like pelvis, which a sheep and goat pelvis is about this big. A cow pelvis would be about this big. And they're breaking them into smaller pieces. And I think they're actually breaking them up to be able to fit conveniently into a cook pot, in a sense. And so they're breaking them down into something that works for cooking this meat in a different kind of way. And so the other thing I sometimes get is these specially butchered things. And they're specifically from pork shoulder blades and jawbones, from the mandibles. And so what these are, they aren't with cleavers. They're with small little knife slices. I'm not sure if you can see this, but on the underside of these shoulder blades are about 5 to 8 long knife slices on them. And same thing on these mandibles of pigs. This one you might be able to see. It's much deeper here. But again, I have several right here, and there's a few going down here. And they oftentimes have anywhere from like 5 to 8 of these knife slices. And I'm really perplexed at why there's so many cut marks on a single specimen. So I've done some experimental butchery, and if you get dried and cured meat, it's much more difficult to cut off the bone. And so I think that's why they're leaving more cut marks on these specific specimens. They're curing the pork shoulder blades and then the pig cheeks, in a sense. And other pieces of signs for that are these holes right here in the middle, or this break right here. We find that in Roman sites in Britain on cattle shoulder blades, actually. And other people have hypothesized that's from jamming a hook in there to be able to hang it to dry out. And so that's further evidence that this is probably cured cuts of pork, maybe not too dissimilar from our bacon. And these pig cheeks were probably some sort of delicacy, because you never get the whole jawbone. They're always chopped in either half or even into thirds, into pieces just about this big. So little tiny pieces of cured pig cheek, in a sense, would have been a nice urban little delicacy that you can get in the city of Athens. And so we can even put together these kind of things from the cut marks we're seeing. And what's really cool is different populations of pigs are supplying these sort of cuts of meat versus other things. So those specially butchered jaws, and to a lesser degree scapulas, because I can't age them as clearly, but at least the jaws, they come from older females. So the animals that would have been the breeding population that would have been kept alive a lot longer. While the piglets, on the other hand, the male piglets, are slaughtered at a younger age, and they're not treated in this way. And so we're seeing a sort of different population of pigs go into cured meat versus fresh meat, is how I see that. So yeah, through these kind of animal remains, I can sort of put together the changes that are going on in this marketplace, the sort of new cuts of meat that are showing up, the kinds of things that people are eating that are different. And just like with the water, the example of the water, how water infrastructure changed, we can see similar changes going on in the households. And so we can look at that by looking at sort of storage vessels, these giant pithoi that are larger than me, wider than me. They could fit about 2 people. And these are your sort of typical vessels that you store large quantities of sort of agricultural produce in, right? And so in earlier houses in Athens, you get storerooms that are full of these, right? But later on, in the industrial district, for example, of the 4th century BC, most of these households are just tiny 1 or 2 room structures. They don't have storerooms to store large quantities of produce or food. So they're clearly using the marketplace. They're actually eating there. These are craftsmen, maybe medics or immigrants, or even perhaps slaves or freedmen that are living here. And we can see this in the whole ceramic repertoire. These large storage vessels known as pithoi, they practically disappear from the entire city. By about 400 BC, almost none of them exist. So they're completely gone. People are not storing large quantities of food at the home anymore because they're able to get it in the marketplace. And so they're changing their household layouts and the types of storage vessels that are there. So this is the original repertoire of storage vessels in Archaic Athens up until 500 BC or so. that one disappears and you're just left with these smaller vessels throughout the city because you don't need to store as much food at home. And we can see other kinds of changes among the cookpots. So for example, up until about 500 BC, this one on the left, this lidless kitra, is the only type of cookpot that exists in Athens. It can't have a lid. It's a pretty large sort of soup pot. Because it can't have a lid, it really can't be used for a wide variety of cooking methods, probably just fast boiling. Around 500 BC, this new type of kitra that can hold a lid is introduced. So now they're able to stew, for example, or to braise. And then finally, in the end of the 5th century BC, a third type of cookpot is introduced known as a lopos. It oftentimes has a flat bottom, and it probably could have been used to fry food. And we're seeing an increase at home of how people are preparing food. They're not preparing the same kind of soups and maybe, I don't know, grilled cuts that they were before, but instead they now have a diverse repertoire at home of how they're preparing these new cuts of meat and maybe the new kinds of veggies or whatever that are showing up in town themselves. And at the same time, we get these textual references showing up at the end of the 5th century BC with these sort of fancy chefs. And they're mentioning all these different types of cooking that are going on, these magiroi that they're actually using. And so this is sort of when we first start seeing sort of elite chefs, and they show up in comedy a lot. They're made fun of because they're what the rich would have, of course. But even in normal homes, we're getting this diverse repertoire. So even in sort of ordinary homes, they're cooking food in a very different way. A similar change occurs with the dining vessels. Down to about 480 BC, all you really see is this small stem dish. And then this one handler, it's a bowl with one handle. People hypothesize you could dip that into a cook pot for your soup. That's why it has one handle. And over the course of the classical period in the 5th and the 4th century BC, we see an explosion of different kinds of dining vessels. So for example, the handleless bowl, sort of more formal dining, yet has to be served, for example. Or different kinds of plates for the first time start showing up. So dry food is more part of the cuisine than the wet food that they were having before, the kinds of soups. And so this is a major change in what's going on in the household. People are eating different kinds of food, prepared in different kinds of ways, and there's a whole new formality in terms of how you eat this food at home, in order to, a whole new repertoire of dining dishes. It's a whole new sort of life that's going on. And so if you think about all these different foodways, we can see how they're all interconnected and how they're all changing in tandem, in a sense that the Athenians are able to build this infrastructure. They're able to develop these trade contacts through empire or other means. But it's actually stimulating a change that persists down into the 4th century and into the Hellenistic period. And one of the things I think is going on, though I'm not 100% sure, more research needs to happen, is I think there's similar things going on at other cities, as other cities get larger in the Greek world. And so I know more research needs to be done into this kind of ugly trash, into this trash that sort of people have not been saving or looking at for 100 years. But there's a real serious story that it can tell. And so, I think you guys need to think about that when you throw out your own trash. What it says about you and what you're eating, and how that's probably a little different from what you write down in your diet journals, for example, and what archaeologists of the future might be able to say about you as an individual or us as a society. And I hope you think that there's a little bit of similarity here with the modern world, because I thought this comic from the Oatmeal sort of summarizes it. Asian food in a small town, 5 different countries, 1 awful restaurant, known as Diarrhea Dragon, of course. Or Asian food in a big city, 5 different countries, 5 different restaurants. And you see this kind of diversity in our own cities that grow up because of this sort of well-stocked marketplace and different types of techniques that are used to prepare food in a new, diverse sort of manner. And so, yeah, this is what I try to work on, to put together these changes at this time, not just in Athens. I work on a number of different sites as well, and trying to piece together foodways in Greece. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take any. And I do a lot of outreach on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter, follow me. I have a lot of fun threads on animals and the ancient world and food and things like that. So check me out. Yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions.